Thank you to B4E for this very exciting conference. I'm just going to show you a few slides to put in context what really green growth is, particularly within the urban context. It's been an amazing ride so far, hasn't it? When I was at high school, world GDP was $15 trillion. In real terms, we're now over 50 and will be 100 by 2030. As a result, where poverty exists in the world has shifted radically. This is 2005. The big circle there is India. The next circle is China. Move on to 2015. India has shrunk very substantially down here, slightly smaller than Nigeria. You can't even really see China. It's that little brown circle over on the right-hand side. This is extraordinarily good news, and as time goes by, of course, India is shrinking more and more. So a good news world, but also a bad news world. We've heard this morning from several speakers just how serious things are. There's no question that climate change is a major threat to us, and we can't keep doing things the same as we've done so far. 13 million hectares every year being lost in forests, 3.3 million people dying because of soot and smoke. And as Ashok Khosla told us so brilliantly this morning, and I do urge you to look at the website, the UNEP one, or the panel that he's on, the 20th century was really about declining commodity prices. And the last decade has seen what is, in the minds of most analysts, a historic change. We've now moved from a relatively empty world. Remember when we grew up, we were taught we're in the Holocene era, and now, of course, we're moving into the Anthropocene era, the first time in the history of the world that humans can actually influence the shape of the planet. But I want to talk about two massive demographic transitions, both of which are central to the private sector, and how we handle them will determine the future of the planet. One of them, obviously, is urbanization. If you lived in 1800, 97 out of 100 people were living in rural areas, and now, of course, we're going to be at 70% urban by 2050. Every decade at present, almost 900 million people move to cities or are added to city populations. Never in the history of the world have we had anything like that before. How those people live, how they go to work, what sort of transport systems will determine the future. And decisions made now will be with us for 200, 300 years to come. And the other even more massive transition going on is the explosion of the middle class. 1 billion globally in the middle class, defined by the OECD in 1990, 2 billion today, and in the next 20 years, another 3 billion people. This is a huge, huge transition. It is wonderful news because these are people now who, for the first time ever, don't have to worry about falling back into abject poverty. They can live dignified lives. So 3 billion added in the next 20 years, of which 90% will be in Asia, the vast bulk of which will be in India and in China. Good news indeed, except this may well be our future. If we look at vehicles, 250 in 1970, 1 billion today, slightly less than a billion. We don't know what it's going to be, but it could be up to 3 billion, giving us a world that would be very different indeed. And obviously, India is central to the urbanization challenge. This is back there in 1991. This is 2011, and this is how things will look in 2031. 12 cities over 1 million in 1981. This is India, up to 87 cities, providing amazing business opportunities. Still much less urbanized than China, which will have 220 cities over 1 million by 231. But nonetheless, this is a shift of massive commercial as well as ecological importance. I want to make a very simple point that how our cities grow is a choice, and the choice is actually not made simply by city planners. It actually is made by private sector leaders and by citizens. Here are the trends of some cities. The vertical axis is carbon emissions. This is GDP per capita, and you see some cities have chosen a high carbon path, others have chosen a low carbon path. It is a choice. This is a dramatic illustration of this. This is China. This is per capita emissions at the national level in China. This is per capita emissions at the national level in the United States. This is Beijing's emissions per capita. This is New York City's emissions. So in other words, cities can be part of the problem or cities can be part of the solution. It is a choice. So what is this green growth thing that we're discussing here today? It is, at one level, very simple. It's simply enjoying growth and jobs and well-being and prosperity, but doing it in a way that doesn't damage the planet. But actually, there are a couple of hypotheses embedded in the green growth theory and increasingly practice that are extremely important. And they are these. And I'm using the famous marginal abatement cost curve to illustrate this. This simply says, if you want to reduce your amount of pollution along here, you can do so at very low or negative cost to start with, and the further you go, you're going to have to pay an incremental cost. And you can look at some countries. This is Mexico, for example, some work the World Bank did. The two hypotheses are this. Number one, there is a huge amount under the zero line. And that means that actually we can address at least half of the problem of pollution and climate change in a way that will immediately benefit the economy. In other words, these are things that we should have been doing all the time, but for well-known reasons we haven't. Issues like how you plan your transport system, how you plan your cities, the extent to which you do energy efficiency. And the fact that there is an environmental constraint will encourage us to do what we should have done all the time. This will immediately boost growth. And there's a huge amount of research going on right now that shows that the area under here is much greater than we thought. So that's hypothesis number one. And hypothesis number two is that even when you go up here to the areas that will actually cost you something, some types of environmental technologies are more expensive than the old-fashioned way of doing business. And this is the Porter hypothesis. Basically says smart environmental regulations and good private sector leadership will lead to more technology, more investment, more jobs. And there's a great deal of research going on about that now. This is why the private sector has to be a leader not only in implementing green growth, but in influencing government to put in place the right policies. Let me give you a couple of examples. Here's Ahmedabad, back to cities again. Ahmedabad has a huge choice in front of it. This is today. And these are a couple of trajectories. In 2041, the World Resources Institute have been working with the authorities there and the private sector there, thinking through these issues. It turns out that if Ahmedabad follows what we call a high automobile policy, it will have higher costs, lower growth, more lost time in traffic, more fatalities, and will contribute 6 times as much carbon. But it could go this path. It turns out that the path on the right is not only better for the environment, it is much better for the private sector and for citizens too. Now, everybody knows that India is going to be moving away rapidly from this. The question is it moving to this and this? And by the way, there are lots of cities in the world today that are losing 10% of their city GDP because of time spent in traffic. 10% just taken off the top. Or do we want to move towards this? Now, this is not just an issue for planners and governments. This is an issue for the private sector and for citizens. All of us would say, yes, please, we would like this. Or yes, please, we would like this. And this, which is the first complete bus rapid transit where we've been working with the city of Ahmedabad, like this, turns out this is great for the economy. People get to work quicker, traffic accidents go down, and so on. Here are some of the cities that are implementing bus rapid transits. The World Resource Institute makes this a major product line of us because the rates of return are so good, not only for the environment, but for safety as well, and for economic competitiveness. Now, the question is, will India be willing to go one step further? Why is it that when I just spent 3 years living in London, not on a single day ever did I even think of driving my car into London, and I never will for the rest of my life? Never. And yet, I now live in Washington, D.C., where I drive into town all the time. Why? Because London has figured out that actually it is better for the economy to have regulations that make it expensive. And it's a question whether or not a country like India and whether or not the private sector would say, yes, actually this makes sense. I want to turn to one final issue. I've talked about transportation and the shape of cities. I want to talk about energy. The World Resource Institute has just done a survey of the 1,200 coal-powered electricity generating plants that are currently under planning or construction in the world. Here they are. It looks okay until you add India, and then you add China. Now you ask, why are we still investing so heavily in coal? Well, one of the reasons is this. We're paying ourselves to invest in coal. The world is investing almost $500 billion. The IMF came out with numbers last week, $480 billion invested in encouraging people to consume more fossil-based fuel. At the same time, we're investing less than $70 billion subsidizing renewables. So it's not surprising we're heading in that direction, and it's not surprising that Beijing has just had the worst pollution day in history ever. Not surprising either that the average environmental cost of pollution, this is just pollution and a few other things, this doesn't measure impacts of climate change or anything like that. This is the loss to GDP of pollution around the world as a share of GDP, and these are some of the countries, and you see, quite a few of them are heading up towards the 10% of GDP level. And remember, on top of that, I already said that some cities are losing 10%, which is an additional 10% of GDP from congestion. This is bad for the economy. Now, some countries are doing this, and it makes a lot of sense. We have the privilege to work with private sector companies, originally in the United States. Now we're doing it in Bangalore with the Confederation of Indian Industry, whole range of companies such as Infosys, Google, Wipro, Accenture, a whole range of them. And this is what they're saying. They're saying, we want renewable energy. And we want it for several reasons. We want it for energy security, because once we've got it, we know we can rely on it. Also, security of prices. Once we've got it, we know the price won't jump up and down. And we want it because actually it also leads to a better quality of life and less pollution. But it's difficult for us to do it. We want to buy it, but the utility isn't ready to do it. We've got developers who are willing to build the renewable energy. We've got financiers who are willing to finance them. Those developers don't want to have a relationship with the utility. They want to have a relationship with the blue chip companies here. So we're getting together a group called the Green Power Purchase Alliance. And already in the United States, that's had a radical impact on the way that energy is bought and sold, solar panels on your roof, selling to the grid, buying back from the grid, developers over here using the grid to transmit green energy to these blue chip purchasers. This is an example of the private sector leading in a very, very concrete way. Just a final word about the World Resource Institute. We are a global think tank, but also a do tank focusing on the most important and urgent issues that need to be addressed in the coming 2 decades. And that includes cities and energy and climate change and water and forests and food. And it's a privilege for us to be having a substantial sized office here in India, working very hard. We are the ones that are the keeper of the greenhouse gas protocol in terms of how greenhouse gases are measured at the city level, at the company level, and at the national level. We also prepare tools that are of value to the private sector. This is a new tool we have called Aqueduct, which measures water risk. Companies like McDonald's, Procter & Gamble, and many others now use that. So finally, to reset the compass, we're currently pointing in the wrong direction, as Ashok and others told us this morning. And what an organization like us is doing, and what an organization like B4E is doing, and what your company is trying to do, is change the compass back to point us in the right direction. I want to leave you just with the message of engagement with public discourse on policies. Around the world, the history of environmentalism is not governments leading. It is people saying, we want change. And nowadays, it is the leading business companies saying, it's good for our growth, it's good for our bottom line, as well as good for tomorrow's citizens. Thanks very much.